Just imagine the New York of 1980.
Hello and welcome to Every Single Sci-Fi Film Ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Today we'll be talking about a film that I think is a bit of an anomaly. Just Imagine is a film by David Butler made in 1930. The reason is that it is a musical. It is a musical rom-com sci-fi. One hell of a mixture. I think it's the kind of film that you either love or hate. So I would love to hear from you. Either put your thoughts in the comments or message me on Instagram at Every Sci-Fi Film. I want to say an even bigger thank you to everyone who's been listening and giving this podcast a chance. I'm really overwhelmed. And to those of you out there who have sent me messages of support, encouragement, it really means a lot. Thank you so, so much. Now on to my heavily qualified guests. Jay Talott is Professor Emeritus of Film and Media Studies at Georgia Tech. He has written/edited numerous books and articles on science fiction film, including Just Imagining the Metropolis of Modern America. Welcome to the show, Jay. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine.
Wonderful. I'm thrilled to welcome back Lisa Yazik, who is Regents Professor of Science Fiction Studies, also at Georgia Tech. She has written/edited numerous books on science fiction and teaches Just Imagine as part of a class on futurism, fashion, and science fiction design. Welcome back, Lisa. How are you?
I'm doing great, and it's so great to be back. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. So Just Imagine, I think it's a slightly strange film, but can we start with how and why this film came to be? Jay, let's go to you first.
There are too many things I could say here. I'll probably have to be cut off because there are so many cultural reasons why this film came to be. There are industrial reasons why this film came to be. And then I suppose we might even say there are artistic reasons of why this film came to be. But just think about the nature of American society in 1929, 1930, 1931. This is a period when something like the Empire State Building is being built, and it is attracting enormous amounts of attention, publicity, etc. Art and architecture of this period. This is a period where city planning is very big. There are a number of exhibitions, art and architectural drawing exhibitions that attract enormous attention. Something called the Titan City exhibit in New York draws thousands of people. So there people are seeing and thinking about cities, about buildings. We're in the midst of the machine age. This period between the turn of the century and 1940, there's this enormous machine and technology and science consciousness that's arising, and it's influencing a great number of films, influencing some science fiction films, but it's influencing other kinds of films as well. This is a period where Fox Film Corporation, so I'm getting us back to the movie itself, Fox Film Corporation has tended to think big. And one of the reasons why this film comes into being is David Butler does a film the year before called Sunny Side Up, which also has Elle Brendel, one of the stars of Just Imagine.
He plays a guy who's been brought back to life from the 1930s, and he's kind of nicknamed Sing-Lo, and he's quite a comedy character in the film.
Right, he's the central comic character. David Butler, the director, had just done Sunny Side Up. It was the fourth highest grossing film of the year, and it was a musical, and musicals were enormously popular. The top 10 films of 1929 are all musicals.
Which is amazing.
So why did this film get made? David Butler, musical, success, Elle Brendel, machine age, city consciousness. That's enough for a start.
That's a great start. I just wanted to get into context. We're currently like the Wall Street crash has just happened around a year prior. So the reason the musicals have come to Hollywood is apparently because Broadway can't afford to keep them running. Are people looking for an escape at this point?
I don't think it's so much a case of Broadway not being able to afford musicals. After all, the top grossing film of 1928 is a musical. This is before the Depression. This is before the Wall Street crash. The top grossing film of one of the top grossing films of 1927 is a musical. Sound comes in. The sound comes in. The industry hurriedly tries wiring theaters, thousands of theaters nationwide. Why were they going to wire them? To make the best, most attractive use of this new technology. And Fox Film Corporation, the makers of Just Imagine, they are a company that has always been in the forefront of technological innovation. They are the ones who innovate sound on film. They are doing, when Lindbergh takes off to fly the Atlantic, Fox has a sound camera unit at the airport. And within the same day that Lindbergh takes off, there is a sound newsreel in the Fox theaters in New York. So they're trying to exploit sound in the best way possible. The film, of course, that kicked all this off is The Jazz Singer, a musical, or at least part musical and part silent. So musicals are the way to go. This is not Broadway connected. This is not necessarily Depression distraction oriented. This is what has been proven from 1927 up through 1930 to be the way to make profits.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Lisa, so I think it's amazing that every single top 10 US film in 1929 was a musical, but that goes down to just kind of 2.5 in 1930. What do you think the reason for that was then?
I think that this is, I would guess that people were fatigued, right? Pop culture generations are short, like 3 or 4 years in general. So I would imagine that by the time we get to Just Imagine, people have had those for 3 or 4 years at that point. And I'm just guessing it's time to flip the script. Jay, you're the expert though on film. Back me up here. Does that sound right? Am I on the right track?
You're on the right track. And there were so many musicals made in 1920, late 28, 1929, just a flood of musicals. They don't go away. David Butler, 1931, is going to do more musicals. I think it's delicious. And it's a success. He does the first Can I Get Yankee in King Arthur's Court? And it is a success. So they don't go away, but the numbers decline rapidly and it becomes a specialty.
And in terms of making this science fiction, can you talk a bit about why that was?
Yeah, I think it makes sense, right? Science fiction was a fairly new genre. Obviously, people have written speculative fiction as long as human recorded history, but commercial genre science fiction, the way we understand it now, like with its own, authors and editors and publishing venues and artists and rules for success, were still fairly new. And right, Hugo Gernsback had just founded Amazing Stories, the first science fiction magazine, specialist magazine in 1926. And people didn't even use the word science fiction very regularly till 1929, 1930. Having said that, it was a wildly popular genre. I think that Amazing Stories reached about 250,000 readers and subscribers in its first couple of years. And we are now finding out, actually, I just found this out from some research I'm doing elsewhere, like other people would copy this. So for instance, we've just discovered a whole cache of science fiction stories in the African-American newspapers at this time. And one of my very favorite stories, it's a big pulp space opera story. I'm working right now to republish it. But it's called Amazing Stories, 100 Years Hence, like not even attempting to do anything except acknowledge that how much it's in dialogue with the mainstream magazines. And this was in a Black newspaper. So clearly everyone is playing up against science fiction like it's the cool new thing, right? And it's not certainly as popular as it's going to be after World War II. But it's cool, it's big. And I think it really articulates with especially America's increasing fascination with engineers and scientists, right? This is the era when both science and engineering are professionalized. And like Jay said, this is the moment of superstructure design, right? That we're getting these massive sort of engineering projects. And I think that kind of excitement gets people interested, of course, in the genres that are going to explain to them what it means to live in these new technocultural futures. And science fiction gives that to you, apparently with a great deal of comedy and a few songs and a little romance too.
Absolutely. So this is a very film of its time. We're dealing with many films of their time. So the sensibilities, I wanted to go into that before we kind of tackle the whole thing. You know, Elle Brendel is doing a very faux Swedish accent and really hamming that up.
I don't know, boys. Give me the good old days.
Are you both the kind of people who put on your 1930s heads for watching a film like this? Or do you still read it with your kind of 2024 heads on?
Well, myself, I always try to be in the context. And I've always talked to my students about when they say, well, this is not realistic. I say, well, there's always a contemporary realism. And so you have to think in terms of the contemporaneous realism of that period. And it's very true to its period. Yeah. I'm not offended today by the way that people talked at that particular point and reacted to that particular point. They're long gone. So we don't worry about those reactions now.
And Lisa, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. So first of all, my students are always so confused by Elle Brendel. Not the idea that there's going to be some sort of broad racist caricature. Like they're expecting that, but they're like Swedish. They're like, whoa, did not see that one coming at all. So they are mightily amused by that. But then we talk about the fact that he originally on vaudeville had a German accent, and then he had to change that when Germans became persona non grata in the United States. So they actually find that kind of interesting. And then we sort of parse through why it's okay to make fun of like a white immigrant in this kind of context. So that's cool. I'm fascinated by the gender stuff in this movie, right? Like, because, this is just 10 years after suffrage. But also we're moving into the kind of feminist backlash that we experience every single time women or any other kind of sexual minority gains any kind of rights. So, and you can see the movie really kind of trying to play both sides of that, I think, especially in the moment with the census taker.
Why, you men have all the best of it. For instance, you can file an application to marry me, which I can accept or reject. But I can't put in an application to marry you.
Not a bad law at that.
That census taker, she articulates an amazing gendered critique of like the entire problem of this bizarre world they live in. Like, she is like, why is it that a group of men are telling women who they have to marry? Like, and you're like, yeah, why is that happening? That's a great question, right? But then, of course, it's contained by the fact that she's presented as dowdy and middle-aged and not fun and not cool and not hip like all the young people in the movie are, right? And all the young people, of course, it's right after this that our protagonist, our hero, nominal hero, like launches into a song about like how he wants a girl like his grandma, right?
No, it's no use, Hardy. I like a girl like my grandmother used to be.
And I mean, the argument that's made about gender in that movie, kind of, it's annoying, I suppose, but it's also interesting in so much of its time. And I think it's important to really put it in that context. The other thing I want to note that blew my mind is when they go to Mars and Elle Brendel is hanging out with the Queen's head of security, and he says, she's not the Queen, he's the Queen. And I'm like, are you kidding me? And I went and looked it up, and sure enough, Queen had been popular slang for gay up through the 1930s. It actually becomes less popular in the 1930s and 40s. So he's at the end of a moment of slang that we won't see again for like 50 years. And or at least not so much in popular culture. And I was just like, that's interesting. And it's like, is this like an amazing moment where we're using the language that gay people themselves were beginning to use? Or is this a horrifying moment? I think it's more horrifying, but at the same time, it's like the joke gets made and then the two guys are arm in arm for the rest of the movie. Like, I just don't know what to do with this. It's fascinating.
Well, of course, it couldn't have happened unless it was a pre-code film.
Oh, 100%. 100%.
Pre-code. You get away with a lot of things in pre-code era.
I'm impressed.
Before 1934, all sorts of jokes crop up in movies that you wouldn't expect.
I always put on my kind of contemporary hat. So when I watch a 1930s film, I read it in 1930s. I do not find Elle Brendel offensive. I don't even find the sexism offensive. Luckily we've moved on. So it almost seems kind of quaint looking back on it.
Yes.
Not that we're not that we're at 100%, but you know, it is kind of charming in its own way. And I think the thing I find confusing is the thing you're mentioning is that I like my sci-fi kind of dark and dystopian. And this is why I think we should bring in Jay's article here. America is so optimistic about the future. And I think that's what your article's kind of getting at, Jay, that we don't get that kind of dystopian feel. We don't get this kind of dark and, oh no, the future is coming and everything is going to be bad. It's like, yeah, something's going to be bad, but we'll kind of get on with it. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Well, just the general cultural context. You know, the late 20s and throughout the 1930s is a period of World's Fairs, and especially in the U.S. And so not too long after this film, we're going to have the Great Chicago World's Fair, which has a futuristic theme to it. And then we're going to have the 1939 World's Fair in New York, which is pointedly building the world of tomorrow. That is its announced theme. 1937 San Francisco exhibition also has that futuristic flair to it. So even as a depression is taking grip on the people, they're still looking positively to the future. And as Lisa said, you know, the engineer is presented as a heroic type. He's going to re-engineer society.
Yeah.
One of the most popular movements of this period, 1929, 1930, 31, 32, so peters out toward the middle of the 1930s, is something called the technocracy movement.
I was going to bring up technocracy.
The technocracy movement in the U.S. is enormous. They publish newspapers, magazines, books, all about a proper technological foundation for society and fixing the problems of society through rational scientific engineering processes. This is something that people are buying into. In part, they are laughing at it. It becomes the foundation for jokes, but at the same time, it's inuring them to the darker side of technology. That's not as bothersome. If you can see it and laugh at it and embrace it, you're not going to be afraid of it. And there's something of that to be said about this film. There's a comment by Frederick Pohl, one of the top science fiction authors. He said that science fiction is the sovereign prophylactic against future shock. And I think we might want to think about Just Imagine as a prophylactic. It's making us laugh, allowing us to open up to science, technology, the future, even in the midst of terrible things. And it protects us in that way.
I mean, I'm with Jay. I think technocracy explains so much here. I mean, and the movie itself literally dramatizes a lot of the principles of technocracy, which was, I mean, the main one, which was that, you know, everyone would have a good shot at a decent education. And then somehow this was going to work out as a meritocracy where the best rose to the top and everyone just acknowledged it. But that's literally what the whole marriage plot is organized around, right? It's the guys who do the most impressive thing. It's so Darwinian in this really crass and stupid way. Mm-hmm. And I point out, in 1930, technocracy wasn't a joke. There were 250,000 people who were registered as technocrats, like for their political affiliation. That's pretty significant, especially in an era when not that many people could vote. So,
and Herbert Hoover was proclaimed as a technocrat, one of the reasons why he was elected.
And of course, the early science fiction magazines, this is the things that always surprises my students when we do the history of science fiction, is the reality is early science fiction, as it was developed in the commercial and especially American magazines, it's techno-optimistic. I mean, that was the whole point. Mm-hmm. We don't even need to go to Fred Pohl. Hugo Gernsback, founder of Amazing Stories, said that science fiction, the 20th century was going to be the century of science and technology, and we needed science fiction to get all hands on deck and get people interested and educated. And it struck me when I was watching Just Imagine, the plot is really indebted to Hugo Gernsback's Ralph 124C. I mean, they're both like big Metropolis type stories, like in these big high tech engineered futures. They both revolve around a love story, and everyone ends up in outer space eventually. So what I think is really interesting about this movie, right, and is interesting about all early science fiction movies is how much they provide us with essentially the visual guidelines and maybe even cliches that have really shaped science fiction. And a lot of that comes from early directors embracing futurism, right? So, right, early in the 20th century, you have all these exciting new political and cultural movements, right? And in particular, you have the Italian futurists and the Russian constructivists, both of whom are arguing that one of the most important ways that we're going to be able to intervene into the thinking of the masses, for lack of a better word, and sort of prepare people for the future is through fashion, right? Because fashion was just becoming a thing. It was the first time people could get pre-made clothing and actually have multiple outfits and things like that. And so the idea was we're going to intervene here. And if we show people how to dress for the future, somehow they'll be ready for the future. Love the idea. I always say if you can't actually like feel good, right, put a good hat on and some lipstick or something. So it sort of works. It's like fashion is its own prophylactic, I think, essentially, if we're going to continue with that metaphor.
Just wanted to mention that, so the futurists, as I kind of thought I knew about them, was kind of an artistic movement, but it was far more than that. It was kind of a social, artistic, and even political movement.
Everything, cultural, yeah. And I mean, the Italian futurists wrote multiple fashion manifestos, and it's interesting how they change over time. You can see when they're very young and very inspired by the Fordicists, then they have this moment where they grow up and some of them get married and they're kind of interested in feminism. And then, of course, fascism comes, and then they're all sort of pro-Mussolini, and it's all about the Italian hat and the need for a hat on a head. It gets really phallic and weird, I think. But, right, the cool thing that the futurists and the Russian constructivists did is they thought about ways to make clothing work for modern people, that your clothing should be practical, that the uniform dressing was really important to people. We see it now as very dystopian. But in a world where you could distinguish people's classes based on what they were wearing, the idea that everyone would wear a uniform and we couldn't tell class anymore, very revolutionary, right? And very much fits, especially with, I think, Soviet constructivist politics, for sure.
And so in this film, they have their little matching kind of jackets, which are very 1930s, except that they have no pockets.
Yeah. And everything's on angles, right? Because like there's these certain elements that you associate with futurist design, like sharp angles, hard edges, high-tech materials, transformative materials, things that will surprise and shock you. I mean, the futurists, Thomas Marinetti and Volt, they wanted women to wear clothes that would like have fireworks and things that sprayed you and scents and like explosions and knives coming out of them. Like,
where can I get
weapons.
these clothings?
Oh, I know. Well, my students, I always have people design stuff. Actually, it's one of the things we do. I should, where you'd get it. My students in my fashion and design class.
I need numbers.
I think we see that right a little bit. Like it's not as aggressive as perhaps the futurists would have wanted, but there is surprise, and there is that kind of like there's the angularity, there's the cleanness, there's the high tech materials, and there are surprising moments in the fashion of Just Imagine, and they're sort of at key moments like. I think it's when our hero gets out of his airplane and goes into his business office, and all of a sudden he peels back the aviator helmet and it transforms his jumpsuit into like a business suit. And you're like, oh, that's pretty cool. And this is literally the kinds of things that the Italian futurists were designing. Like the Varst jumpsuit, where you would like, when you went to work, you'd put on like maybe a tie with it. And then at night you'd put on a cummerbund and your little flats and go out dancing. And so it's cool that you see that there. And of course, there's the amazing moment with the woman who is in her day clothes to fly to Paris, right? But knows she's going to need her evening gown. And so she shows everyone how her gown will transform.
Well, how do you like my new dress? It's a brand new model. It's called a Stay Out.
Stay out?
Mm-hmm. You see, if you fly over to Paris some afternoon and you want to stay out for dinner, presto.
And that to me feels very futurist. It is surprising. Maybe not as aggressive again as they would have liked, but that's not a particularly aggressive movie.
Not at all, I think. And that's the other thing that I think when I watch it, and so it doesn't feel very kind of serious, dark sci-fi to me, but at the same time, it's so much fun. I think, Jay, you were saying that there's a lot of things which I took for granted in terms of things that they foresaw, like video calls. Like there's a lot of like smaller kind of tech things. Can you maybe list some of those off, Jay?
Let me first off preface this by an announcement that Fox Film Corporation made about this film. They were so proud of this film and its forward-looking attitude that they announced they were going, and I don't know if they actually did this. This is one of those publicity announcements that may or may not have had any kind of legs to it. But they announced that they were going to preserve a copy of this film and put it in a time capsule along with a projection mechanism, which is how they described it. They would deposit it at what was known as Movietone City, and then reopen it in 1980 to determine how many of the things they predicted had come true. I've never seen a follow-up to this. Like I said, I don't know that they ever actually did it, but it does mean that they were invested in exploiting those predictions that they offered. Mm-hmm. And those predictions, a number of them are indeed true. Television, television was not something that most people had no idea of in 1930. It's only in the late 30s that we start seeing television actually making very, very small inroads. And then World War II is going to stop all that. But yeah, 1935, Berlin is doing some local television. 1936, BBC is doing some local television. 1939, New York City, there's television broadcasts that reach out a mile or so, 2 miles from the Empire State Building where it's originated. But television, one thing. The video phone, another thing. A small thing like the electric hand dryer is something that's going to come to pass. You can't go to a restroom now without having an electric hand dryer. The light alarm. You pass a beam of light and an alarm goes off. We have that now. Of course, obviously, rocketry into outer space. They missed, and there are a few other things, and they miss on some things, like we don't have floating traffic cops, thank God, and we don't have these traffic jams of airplanes, the personal airplanes everywhere. And space travel, we know, it is damn hard. You can't just jump in a rocket and go somewhere. You get killed that way. They miss on a few things, but certainly by 1980 they've hit on a good half dozen predictions about the future, and this tends to be one of the attractions of this kind of film. It's something that they didn't play up enough, and this is why I said that unfortunately they didn't play up El Brendel enough, because this is the way in which this sort of film should work, and that is you have a character who is awakened into some other time, like Connecticut Yankee, for example, and he becomes our guide into all these new things that we can anticipate, or in some cases, cringe back against. Yeah, there are hits and misses, and Fox, I think, caught on a little too late to how invested they should have been in trying to get to foreground all those possibilities.
I'm just, as I'm listening to Jay list the hits and the misses, it's interesting to me that the misses, which are pretty spectacular, the vertical city with vertical traffic, and of course Mars, those are the parts that are most clearly indebted to earlier science fiction movies, right? I mean, the vertical city, that's just Metropolis done as a utopia or utopia-ish thing rather than dystopia. And the whole bit on Mars, I mean, she's like a poor man's Queen Aelita, right? I mean, down to the outfit and the angular, she's got the really aggressive futurist design. You always give like the bad guys the super aggressive futurist design. Like in America, it's the visual logic of American science fiction cinema. Everyone wears like some kind of futurist elements in their clothing. The good people get it softened and it looks more like glamorous Hollywood clothing. The bad people get it really angular and insect-like looking.
Ming the Merciless.
Yeah, right. Queen Aelita, Ming the Merciless. You can go forward in time. Like I remember the Cardassians on Star Trek, on some of the franchises from the 80s and 90s, all that hard angularity. But we always do it. The bad guys always wear hard, angular, metallic stuff. And that's how you know they're bad. There's no softness about them. No, it's too much futurism. It's too much future without any human tempering, whatever that means, you know.
So it is retro-futurist. It has this vision for the future, but it's very, very stuck in the 1930s. And I just wanted to talk a bit about that because we've got Singalo, the El Brendel character, who yearns for the good old days. He says it multiple times. There's a baby coming out of a vending machine. He yearns for the good old days. You have to take a pill to have a drink, and he yearns for the good old days. So that's done over and over again. And then our hero then yearns for an old-fashioned girl like his grandma used to be. And there's all this futurist kind of optimism, but then also kind of like this yearning for the past. Is that just appealing to the audience of the 1930s?
Well, ultimately, the future is not that different from the present. That's what
just a little bit.
We're constantly being told. The fashions, after all, are not that different from the fashions of 1929, 1930. The actors look and behave like people of the 1929, 1930 period. Especially Marjorie White, I believe that's her name.
Yes, she's a wonderful character.
She really is a flapper. From pre-crash 1920s. So this is a world that we have to feel comfortable in.
Yes.
Before we can embrace any of those other things that might estrange us a bit from a future that we're hurtling towards.
And a lot of early science fiction artists talked about that very consciously. I mean, I don't know if David Butler's thinking about it, but H.G. Wells thought about it a lot. Gernsback thought about it. A lot of the women writers I know thought about it. Like, how do you sell people on like crazy new ideas without completely alienating them and losing them?
Absolutely. What do you think is the ongoing influence of this film? Like, how does it, you've kind of suggested how it's been affected by earlier films, but what do you think is the ongoing legacy?
Well, it's one of a great number of really epic pieces. And this is one of the things that happens to science fiction in film, and that is the 1920s. You see these efforts to make really large, big budget science fiction films. And of course, there's Aelita, the Queen of Mars. There's Metropolis. In 1929, again, right on the cusp of this film, we have The Mysterious Island, which was one of MGM's costliest films and a flop. You have the French La Fin du Monde, The End of the World, and then we have Just Imagine. All of these films are tremendously costly films. So it's not an outlier so much as maybe it is the end of that effort to do these great big epic science fiction films. I want to say none of them which made money. Metropolis, of course, is credited with crushing UFA, the largest studio in the world at that time, and this film helps to crush Fox for at least a little while. Fox declares bankruptcy in 1930.
Yeah, so this is the thing. It's basically doesn't make its money back after having all of that put into it. But I think, Lisa, you were saying there's a way that they kind of worked around this.
Yeah, they did make some of their money back by recycling and selling those props elsewhere, right? And the two most famous examples of that are the ship that they take to the moon is the same rocket ship that eventually shows up in the Flash Gordon serials, right? And the scene where they reanimate our time traveler, our Swedish time traveler, right? All that equipment goes into James Whelan's Frankenstein just a few years later. And those images are going to become absolutely iconic, right? Like when my students watch Flash Gordon or Frankenstein, they're like, oh, that's such a cliche. And you're like, well, this is where the cliche comes from. They're like, oh, but really, I think it's all coming literally from Just Imagine, which is only something I've realized in the last couple of years. So it's cool how much they use the design of earlier films, and then the things they design actually literally get recycled into later science fiction film.
And Buck Rodgers,
Buck Rodgers too.
The scenes of the city are in Buck Rodgers.
That's right. Oh, the orgy scene.
Yes.
The orgy scene too, right? On Mars. There's the orgy scene that gets inserted into Flash Gordon later as well.
So there's a big crab kind of creature. So I was on Reddit when someone told me about this.
Well, it's a god. It's a god that they're offering people to.
Right.
It's the David Butler kinder, gentler version of the Baal god offering various slaves to in Metropolis.
Right.
So it has its correspondence.
Yes,
but
that's a good point.
The whole city scene shows up in Buck Rodgers.
Mm-hmm.
I would guess that he did not pay for this. So I tend to push this notion of making the money back aside. I don't think they ever made the money back on this film, but George Lucas uses it in THX 1138.
Does he?
The opening credits of THX 1138.
The city?
Yeah.
Oh, right. And the city is amazing. Yeah. I mean, so the direction sci-fi goes into, so Frankenstein comes out the year after, and I think horror suddenly becomes a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Is it right to say there's a bit of a lull in, I mean, Frankenstein is sci-fi, but there's a slight lull in this kind of futuristic cinema?
Well, we know that for the most part, science fiction and musical is not going to work. There are still a very few efforts at doing that, and we know they keep trying to do some of that, but it doesn't work. So let's find another blend that does work and does work better. And this is a blend that had already been working, as Lisa will tell you, in the pulp fiction, in Weird Stories, for example.
Yeah. Horror
becomes the more dominant blend in most of the science fiction films that we get through the 1930s. Fewer by far, but they are blends with horror.
Well, Jay, I remember once you had said to me, we were talking about contemporary movies, and you were talking about how things go through cycles. Like we'll go through a science fiction phase, then we go to a horror phase, then a fantasy phase, and we cycle back to science fiction. And it almost feels like that's what we're saying here. Although I think the horrors of the 1930s maybe leave no question about why one would have appreciated horror at that time.
Yeah. Although some of the horror cum science fiction is a rather strange development, with something like Island of Lost Souls, which is really about genetics. And I can't imagine people were thinking that much about genetics in 1932, in the midst of the Depression.
1932, I would argue quite the opposite, Jay. I think a lot of people are thinking about eugenics, right? We're coming out of a 40-year tradition of positive eugenics, right? And especially as advocated by feminists and some other important people, right? And then, of course, we're moving into a moment of tragically negative eugenics as well. So
interesting.
For sure.
Okay, I want to hear about your guys' conclusions of this film.
It is still one of our models for what the future of urban life might be like. And you can find it showing up in a lot of contemporary films. I'm sure that George Lucas has seen this film many times and likes it because it shows up in Star Wars: The Phantom Menace when they show the great city that's the center of that film. So it has colonized modern consciousness in various ways. And yes, I like the fact that it is, you can take all of that with many grains of salt and just sort of revel in its sillinesses.
Lisa.
I am quite fond of this movie, and I've only come to it in the last few years as someone really looking at it. So, maybe my feelings will change over time, but it's so, first of all, just weird and interesting to watch because it's just fighting so many things and trying to juggle so many things at once. And that's cool. But I think it's such a great window into cultural history. You can pair it with the other big epic science fiction movies, right? And really see some interesting differences between the way these kinds of films are being done in Europe versus the way they're being done in the United States. Like I said earlier, you can sort of use it as an interesting window into either sort of thinking about futurism and technocracy in the way that that's starting to sort of inform popular thinking. You can look at it as kind of engaging the gender politics of its day, but also sort of not. Such an interesting at that moment of both feminism and feminist backlash. It reminds you, so much of Hollywood is about disaster, the spectacle of disaster, right? And so many people come to science fiction through film, assume that it's always this overwhelmingly dystopian and negative genre. But the way it developed in the America and to a certain extent Europe in the last couple centuries is much more positive. And we tend to forget that there was that techno-optimistic strain. And I think Just Imagine, for all its flaws, reminds us of that.
Yeah, I think for me personally, I absolutely loved it. It was so charming and silly and fun, and it was really foreign to me in terms of how I expect sci-fi to be, but really in a quite wonderful and cute way. So yeah, I did enjoy it. Do you guys have any recommendations for listeners for things they can look at, learn about, listen to, watch, read, related to this film?
Other films of the period, certainly, and there are some strange films that don't get enough attention or enough love, if you will, or they just are hard to run into. The Invisible Ray from 1936 is certainly worth a look, because it's a very early effort to think about what radium might do in a science fictional context, because it's a film that has the discovery of this special isotope, and the inventor discovers that it can work all kinds of medical wonders. It can cure blindness, for example. But the inventor has also been wronged by other folks, and he turns this into a ray that can also blow things up and blow people up. And then the other one it's a B film that is done on a very small budget by, I think, Columbia Studios, sort of a home of B films, is something called SOS Tidal Wave. And it's set in the future. It is, although it looks like it's the 1930s, and it is about television. And it's about television and media that sort of take over our consciousness, and how you can use the media to tell truths. The protagonist is a newscaster and documentarist, and you can also use it to manipulate the populace.
Thank you so much. Lisa, what do you have?
I've been coming at this from the fashion and design angle, so I'm going to go out on that as well here. And, I had recommended that people perhaps check out some of the early futurist essays to get a sense of what people were thinking about with design and what the elements of futurist design are, and how they get translated into science fiction. So 2 essays that anyone can find online that I would recommend.
And I will add all details as I possibly can in the show notes. So
perfect.
Yep, go for it.
Oh yeah, I can send you the links if you want, and then you can add it to the details. So the first would be Filippo Tommaso Marinetti's The Futurist Manifesto from 1909.
Where it all began.
Yep. And then the second is Volt's Futurist Manifesto of Women's Fashion from 1920. There's also, Marinetti did a manifesto about hats a little bit later. And I can't remember what the exact name of it is. Well, it's when he flips over and starts sort of allying himself with the fascists. And so it's an interesting read about hats and fascism.
Something I would not put together at all. So I definitely
it has to do with virility, that real men wear hats because they have caps on their heads. And you can just go and sort of take that where you want to take that. And then finally, I would suggest one new resource that I think is super, super useful, that I find is really helpful when I'm trying to think about, like, where do these design choices come from in early science fiction film? And this is, it's a web page, actually, and I now have somehow completely lost where it is. Here it is. The web page is called The Shape of Clothes to Come. And it takes us all the way through. It walks us through the futurists and the Russian constructivists, and then shows us how directors from across the world have incorporated that into their film design. And then it moves forward from the 70s forward and does retro-futurism as well. So I think it's a really interesting, cool website, both for people who want to learn about futurism and retro-futurism, but also if you want to learn about how that was expressed through design.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, guys, for coming on. It's been a real pleasure talking about this, what I consider quite a strange science fiction film. So thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thanks for enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks, Aisha. It was great.
Nice meeting you, Aisha.
Great. That's it for this episode. Next episode, I'll be back in 2 weeks and we will be discussing King Kong. There'll be details in the show notes on where you can watch that. Join me then, and if you want to find out what I'm researching and what I'm doing, you can find me on Instagram at Every Sci-Fi Film. If you like the show, please do subscribe or recommend it to people who like really old science fiction films. And I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.